Alrighty, so I've got a cool one here for you. This is going to be a deck video about Mono Green Wat Tambor. It's going to be off-meta stuff, right? This is not prominent right now in any sort of top tournaments, but it's a really cool deck, and it's got some play into some of the top decks. I'll also talk about some of the shortcomings throughout the video, right? I don't try to hide that stuff. But yeah, I think this deck's pretty cool and pretty powerful and does things that basically no other deck does. So you get to play with some cards that you probably wouldn't get to play with otherwise, and I think that's pretty exciting. So what's the deal here with Wat Tambor? So his ability really pushes into being able to play a lot of units. You need units to die, and then you need other units to buff, right? So at the very least, you need 2 units to even do anything with him. Sometimes even more, because then if it's just 2, you might be susceptible to getting removed or getting traded out. So my first inclination with Wat is you got to play a lot of units. You need to go as wide as possible to make his ability as powerful as you can. Now, he is a 5-cost green villain, which innately pushes him into some really powerful cards like Overwhelming Barrage and Super Laser Tech. Ramping, of course, into a 5-cost leader has proven to be pretty powerful. His stats are fine, not super exciting, but okay. And yeah, so we're pushing wide and we're probably aggressive, right? He is an early leader without any sort of built-in longevity. He's boosting power, potentially 4 power, 4/4 worth of stats on his flip turn. So we're looking wide, we're looking aggro, right? And then why mono green? So the 3 double green cards I'm running in this main deck are Attack Pattern Delta, Manufactured Soldiers, and Command. And basically the first 2, I mean, Command's very good. You're going to put that in any mono green deck, but Attack Pattern Delta and Manufactured Soldiers are incredibly important cards in this version of the deck. Manufactured Soldiers, in fact, is like the best go wide card possible, right? You're getting 3 units for the cost of 1 card. Remember, fodder units like 1/1 droids are actually exceptionally good with Wat Tambor because them dying actually gives you more power than them living, right? Your 1/1 dies, and then you get to trigger Wat, which gives actually +2/+2, so you've netted 1/1 worth of stats for that encounter. Potentially 4/4 on the turn that Wat flips, right? That's when you get the double activation on his attack and on the leader side, and then on his attack. And then the other payoff for going as wide as possible is Attack Pattern Delta. 3 cost for 6/6 worth of stats split up is incredibly potent. And remember, the weakest part about Attack Pattern Delta is that you need a bunch of units in play, and then it takes a few actions to cash in the power, and then those units can be interacted with in the meantime. Well, again, Wat kind of cleans up a little bit of that downside, because if they interact with one of the units you've buffed, you then get to buff another unit with Wat. So Attack Pattern Delta can push tremendous amounts of damage, right? 6 damage for 3 cost, can create powerful trades if needed, and we do trade a decent amount, especially when we want to trigger Wat. And lastly, Command. I mean, Command is going to be a staple in any mono green deck kind of regardless, but in a Wat Tambor build, he is a 5-cost deploy, which means you get to, on turn 3, bring him out with Command, right? You can Command, buff something, and ramp. And that's usually what you're going to do with Command if you're going to play it, is to get him out a little earlier. Maybe you do a curve like Manufactured Soldiers, where you're able to trade off a unit, and then you can buff another unit. You can ramp with Command, then you use Wat's ability, then you flip Wat, attack, use his ability again, and you can really push a bunch of damage with that ability. As far as I'm going with 30 health here. I started this build, and actually one of the first builds I posted on Patreon, for instance, was a Droid Manufactory version of this deck. And while Droid Manufactory kind of just fits in perfectly into what we're doing, we just weren't able to race other aggro decks with the 24 health base. While going super wide and getting those droids out is nice, we it really delays when we can close the game, right? Because we're kind of using our Wat flip turn as a setup turn to get more units into play. And the problem is we were just dying too quickly. We weren't able to use all our actions. So I moved away from Jordan Manufactory. As for Energy Conversion Lab, probably still the best base in the game. In this deck, there's just like nothing. I haven't put anything in this deck that's like worth ambushing with, because it's just a very go wide weenie deck. So opted off of Energy Conversion Lab. All right, so here you get to see the full deck list. This will be posted in the description below as well. Any updates that I make to this deck, those will be happening live on my Patreon. So you can check out this deck and more there as well. But this will be published, and this particular list will be linked. So here we go. So the early units, and there's a lot of them. It's a lot of fodders, and you get to play General Tag here, which is really cool, and he's like one of the best cards in this deck. So as you can see, a bunch of cards that you probably wouldn't play in any other deck. We are a trooper based aggro deck because of Tag, and the droids are all troopers, so that's an important aspect of this. We're playing some fodder 1-drops like the Vanguard Infantry and the Warzone Lieutenant. 1-drops help with action economy, us being able to go as wide as possible, meaning we can be in charge of like who has to play cards first, right? Because we're able to take more actions. Tag buffs a bunch of the units in this deck. He can routinely come in as a 2-cost unit that makes 5 worth of stats. Seasoned Sword Trooper is just a fine trooper. And then we've got some fodder stuff like Confederate Courier, which is a unit that dies into another unit. Poggle helps us get the train going. Coruscant Guard is a 3/2 that sometimes will have ambush, but it is also notably a trooper. Droid Deployment, one of our better turn 1 plays, which just immediately puts 2 guys into play. Super Laser Tech, you know, it's a good card in general. It helps us go from 3 to 5 if needed. It's actually like not an all-star in this deck, but it's still good enough. And then because we do have 1 exploit card, which I'll talk about in a moment, it can help there too. Cobb Vanth, another all-star in this deck. Cobb dying and going to find a General Tag is really, really awesome. Just so many stats that you can put out. The units that die into units are just make sure that we maintain things on board. The Magna Guard Wind Leader is a fine unit just on rate, and then it does let you double attack with droids occasionally, but it really is just okay. Talked about Manufactured Soldiers, talked about Command. So overall in Barrage, you know, it's great, but you can do some crazy barrages in this deck because of Wat Tambor's ability, especially on his flip turn where he can give something +4/+4. It can be pretty devastating. Attack Pattern Delta, I mentioned. OC Sobek is our 1 exploit card in the main deck. He's been quite powerful. I think even with sacrificing 1 unit, you get a 3/6 that can eat a 4-drop. And he's pretty durable. And again, if your opponent has to worry about trading into a 3/6 just to free a unit, it will give you a lot of free reign to do things with other units. He's also been very important in matchups against like Sabine, where you can just snag their turn 1 play, and especially if it gets like Wing Leader buffed, and just yank it out of there, and it really helps you win races against Sabine. And then Maul is kind of our finisher here. We really want to end games on the Maul, if not before that. But he offers a giant punch of damage, right? So he works pretty cleanly in this deck. The sideboard I'll talk about a little later, and it is just a theoretical sideboard right now. Just some ideas. All right, so to manage Wat's ability, I mean, a lot of this comes down to maintaining as many units in play as possible. You don't usually want to just like attack into something, then buff something and like be susceptible. You want Wat's ability to be kind of a later thing you do. But suppose like turn 1, you have a couple droids in play. It's not super clean to just like bash your droid into one of their units, and then your other unit can get traded before you can even use Wat's ability. It's why it's really important to get as many actions into play as possible. It's why we have so many low cost units. It's why we have units that die into units like Cobb and Confederate Courier. It's why we have manufactured soldiers to create a bunch of action economy. And remember, Watt's ability is pretty useful in that it also kind of protects the unit that you buff. So you want them to attack into your units, and then you want to buff another unit. It's going to be more difficult for them to kill it, right? It's not just a power buff, it's a defense buff as well. And then you can use that unit to maybe trade or push some damage. And proper sequencing of Watt's ability is something, practice, because it is very slow, right? It's like a multi-action step of like one of your units has to die, then you can buff a different unit, and then finally you can use the unit that's buffed. Managing it on the flip turn is also vitally important because that's when you can get a double activation, as long as you still have a unit that can attack, right? So while using your actions, you want to be mindful that you're keeping something to make sure that you're not completely exhausted out when Wat attacks, because Wat does not buff himself. So you need something else in play to like trigger that. And that's where, manufactured soldiers, Cobb Vanth, all that stuff that lets you kind of churn really helps. Or even attack pattern delta, which might force your opponent to start trading into your units, which then will let Wat power something else up, right? You give something +3/+3 with the attack pattern delta. It's probably not the thing that's dying, but they might kill on the smaller things, and then bam, you can just like buff the big guy again. It's just like that unit is not going to get traded out by a lot of decks and a lot of opponents, so you can really go super tall with one unit. And then the Wat flip turn. So kind of dug into that as well, but it is important to get something to die that turn, and that's not usually particularly difficult in a deck like this. I really like the command on turn 3 to enable an early flip turn, especially if you did something like manufactured soldiers or Cobb Vanth the turn before, which lets you kind of churn a little bit. Command to buff a unit, ramp, maybe use that buff unit to like trade into something. Then Wat can like buff one of the droids that's been left over. Then he can flip, attack, buff something else. And you can like not only push damage, but keep that board a bit clean so that you can go into your 6 resource turn with some units in play, a Wat out. And then even if they're forced to like interact or kill Wat, you can then rebuild and then go towards that Maul turn if needed. Or even just have a big attack pattern delta turn. But yeah, when you're not ramping, it still mostly works the same. You just you want to set up the turn before to have as many units out as possible, and really sequence your buffs well with Wat or with General Tag, who will help you like break thresholds of opponents' removal or opponents like in unit trades, right? You want your unit to die, but you want your opponents to be the ones to kill them. There are times where you will need to force the issue, though. You'll need to sack a droid into something, or maybe use something like O.C. Sobek to just get something dead so that Wat can activate, and that's fine. Wat's activations are very important, especially on his flip turn, because think about it this way: if you get a double activation and you're able to use all 4/4 with the stats, that flip turn actually made 7/10, right? He flips as a 3 power and he creates 4 power that turn, and that is a massive board swing when you can set it up. The last thing to note with the Wat double activation is the overwhelming barrage, which can be crazy powerful if especially in like matchups where you're in different arenas where your opponent can't really deal with like the unit that you're making really tall. So you can like, as long as one thing can die and then you can double buff something, give it +4/+4, even if it's just a droid that's a 1/1, it's a 5/5 now, and it can barrage off for 7 damage. And that's like worst case, right? With a 1/1. If you've got even like a 2 power or 3 power unit, you can create some giant overwhelming barrages. Action economy. So not only the token generators like manufactured soldiers, droid deployment, or even Cobb or the Confederate Courier, like the unit dies into units, those create a lot of actions, either by just having units in play, or Cobb giving you like a free action to play a unit, Confederate Courier giving you another unit. But we also play like 6 1-drops, and just like sometimes just throwing them out there, like it's okay if they die, right? Because then you can activate something else. You just do need to treat a lot of the units in this deck as pretty expendable, but also they can all be kind of scary because of General Tag. So like a turn 1 Warzone plus Vanguard infantry is not a bad turn, even if one of them just dies to something, because then bam, you can buff the other one. You can get your 3-drop into play, or a manufactured soldiers, make 3 more guys, and you're kind of like still okay, right? Like a lot of your cards are worth, they're not like worth much in value, or no, they are worth much in value. They're not worth much in like card quality, right? Like a lot of these cards aren't very good on their own, but they do create a lot of like theoretical cards, right? Manufactured soldiers is like 3 cards. Droid deployment is 2 cards. Cobb is 2 cards. Confederate courier is 2 cards. Poggle is sometimes 2 plus cards, right? So just because all your cards are weak, you have like a lot of them. You have like a lot of artificial units that have been made, and then that's where Wat kind of turns them into realer cards, or Tag turns them into realer cards, or Attack Pattern Delta turns them into realer cards, or Command, right? Like you're playing bad cards, but they synergize really well with the whole package. All right, so when do we going wide is kind of like the setup for this deck, right? Because nothing really works if you're just like playing 1 unit a turn, but you need to set up and then you need to push, right? That's how we go on the offensive, and the most important cards for that are Tag, Attack Pattern Delta, and then closing out with Maul, right? This is how we cash in on the fact that we made a bunch of units, low impact units, and we turned them into higher impact units. These are like the cards that we're playing that do that. Wat on his own does that as well. And this deck is not built to really like board control, but it is sometimes needs to create effective trades, not only to enable Wat's ability where you need a unit to die, but also to help win races against decks like Sabine, where even just getting 1 good kill off can mean the difference between winning a race and losing it. Attack Pattern Delta is not something you usually want to do early, but it is an effective thing to do like on the Wat flip turn, or even the turn after, where you just like bam, present crazy damage. And that's pretty important, because that gap between the 5 to the 7 where you really want to close out with Maul, that's a difficult turn sometimes to navigate, because it's usually going to be a bit weaker in like card quality than a lot of what your opponents are doing, because at that point we don't really want to like set up anymore. Like playing manufactured soldiers on the 6 resource turn doesn't really do anything. At that point, we want to use what we've set up to push as much damage as possible, because this deck will kind of fizzle out eventually, right? It's playing so much synergy and so much nonsense all at once that you get your burst and you get your push, and you get like one really efficient setup, and then you push. If it doesn't like pan out, or if like it gets interacted with too much, you're gonna top deck pretty poorly in this deck. Frankly, you're going to draw like a Vanguard infantry and a general Tag, and you're going to have like 1 unit in play, and it's just like going to all fall apart, right? Doesn't mean it's not good. It just means you need to be aware that like you're not trying to prolong this. You're not trying to like set up, push some, then set up again, right? You're getting like your first few turns as your setup, then you're trying to turn the corner as efficiently as possible, and then you're trying to close with a Maul or some other burst. Interaction. So it is an interaction light deck, but there is some very important pieces. OC Sobek, it took me a bit to like really appreciate this card, but it has been quite good here. The stats are really nice, even with just 1 exploit, being able to take something out of the picture, even if it's just a 2-drop. Of course, you can take a 4-drop with only 1 exploit, but the exploit also enabling Wat is really good. And then this is a key piece in like helping you win races into things like Sabine and Django, because it can yank things out of space. And we are a very light space deck, and we are not trying to trade, right? Our units don't trade effectively because they're all weak. They die, and then other things get buffed. But if we're spending so much time trading, we will eventually fizzle out. So OC has helped kind of solve a bit of the tension in this deck in that way. You can play him on turn 2 off of like a droid deployment or a Confederate courier, and then still even have and then still have like a resource to play with. Sorry, not Confederate courier. You would need, if you to play him on turn 2, you would need to sack 2 units, so like the droid deployments. But that can be okay, especially if somebody like wing leaders on turn 2. Command is another interaction. It's not often used that way, but there are times where you will use it to punch something. Again, I said usually it's going to be a turn 3 ramp experience buff, but there will be times where you just like want to experience, punch something, push, and not worry so much about getting the Wat out earlier. In very fringe cases, and it is part of like the sideboard strategy, at least theoretically, the recursion can be important into some matchups, but that is frankly a very low priority part of it. And lastly, Overwhelming Barrage. The card's kind of crazy and works really well in this deck, and it's kind of like the other thing we do sometimes on the flip turn instead of like fodder or attack pattern delta or like a couple units, get Cobb out, set up for our 6 resource turn up, attack pattern delta. Our turn might just be like trade something, buff something, flip, attack, buff something, barrage, wipe the board, and then like go into the 6 resource turn with probably less units in play than we would like, but also your opponent will have way less units in play. And hopefully you would have pushed a wild amount of damage, because there are times, especially on the flip turn, where one of your units can attack for like 7 or something, or 9. You can do a lot of damage on that turn, and then make your opponent, even an aggro opponent, have to like start interacting with you, which is where you want to be. All right, so the sideboard theory currently. So disclaimer, control, awful matchup, at least as currently constructed. What I talked about a little bit is about fizzling out. So this deck does kind of like, it gets its shot, and then it will kind of top deck not so well. It has a lot of like synergistic cards that aren't really good on their own. And against control, especially a hard control deck like Bosk Blue, something like that, where they're just going to like poke at your things and like, yeah, you're going to push some damage, but they're also going to prevent a bunch of damage. You're going to heal a lot. And then you're just going to have a really hard time rebuilding into decks like that. It is not a good matchup, not even remotely, but I've been thinking a little bit about ways to maybe solve that. And right now I have a very heavy sideboard for it. So we're going to have like a bunch of Relentlesses and Palp's Return, which is usually like the best way to beat a hard control deck, especially when you're in villain green, is just trying to loot Relentlesses. I put Reprocess here as well, which is a way to like bring back Relentlesses or like Mauls or stuff, but then also like it is a one-stop shop to like rebuilding a board completely, making 4 1/1s, right? One thing Boss does sometimes have issue with is like go wide decks. Now, it doesn't care that much when all the go wide units are 1/1s, so this might not really work out as well as I'd like it to, but they do mostly just play 1-for-1 removal outside of Super Laser Blast. And Reprocess, like if we're gonna just try to go very long with them and just like make them have to like beat 5 Relentlesses or something, then that being able to buy back Relentlesses into your deck, as well as Palp's Return bringing them back, and then we have Command in the main deck to bring them back. That's kind of the idea. And then Choose Sides, I think, is like a nice like extra oomph kind of card into like all the mid-range stuff. You're gonna have a bunch of fodder units. It'll make you top deck a little better late in the game, being able to like trade a droid for something important. So this is kind of like step 1 in trying to like solve a really bad matchup. I don't think having like an awful matchup is necessarily a deal breaker into like playing something at a tournament. Other decks do well sometimes and have that, right? Like notably Emperor Palpatine has an awful matchup into Sabine, but still sometimes gets into top cuts because maybe they only played it one time on the way there, right? And then it can do well. So I don't think knowing that you have like a really tough time into control is necessarily something that should mean you never play the deck, but it is something you need to be aware of. The deck has functioned pretty well in like racing situations against Sabine and Django, which I like. Nothing's like easy per se, but it's felt like it has game there. Mid-range stuff can also like interact with you. I think decks that play like Overwhelming Barrage can be a little difficult to navigate sometimes, but you do sometimes put enough stats out that the Barrage, even though it's very powerful, won't be able to clear a board completely. And you can also work to try to like be a little more aggressive in trading into Barrage decks so that they don't have a bunch of units in play, so that they can't effectively Barrage sometimes. On top of that, Barrage decks don't appear to be super popular right now, so we are a Barrage deck. So that is a nice place to be as well. But yeah, I think outside of control being really bad, I haven't identified anything that just completely deletes this deck. And I think you get to play a bunch of different kind of cards that you may not have really ever played with. So what I like to do also with a lot of these videos is present a list of other cards that I would be considering or have considered. So there's like Obedient Vanguard. It's another 1-cost trooper. I think it's less good than the other 2 that are in the deck, but I think it is an option. You've got the Valor equipment that's +2/+2 and Overwhelm to a token. I think it might be worth trying. Outflank is interesting because it lets you kind of shorten actions. I haven't yet felt like it's something that's needed, but it is something interesting to look at. Emperor's Legion would be another like grinding card if you really wanted to transform the deck a bit. The Clone Wars, if you want to go wide, there's nothing that really goes wider than that, although your opponent's the one that gets all the 1/1s. You're the one that gets all the 2/2s. Private Manufacturing, this should very often be a 2-cost draw 2 in this deck, so again, this is for more grinding. Droid Commando, I played with him a bit at first. He's fine. He's almost always going to ambush in this deck. My issue with him in general is that most of the time there aren't great value trades for him because people don't play a lot of 2-power units these days. So usually it's just trading with something. But if you identify that there's like a lot of Yodas or like Sabine unit or like other 2-power things that this can create a very powerful value trade on, then better consideration. Huyang, he works well with like fodder units as well because, you know, a 1/1 becoming a 3/3 is a real thing. Squad support, I mean, I tried it a little bit, didn't work most of the time, but it is kind of cool that this could like create like 5 power or something because of how many troopers you might sometimes have. Darth Vader, very powerful card. Nothing particularly synergistic with him to do in this deck, but he is a good grinding card, especially if we're going to like worry more about control. Just the fact that he can bring a unit or 2 out with him if needed is strong. Admiral Trench, very similar. It's another grinding card. You can, if your board gets wiped, he can basically draw everything back to your hand. So he's kind of like Emperor's Legion, except he is a unit. So that's cool. And then the next 2, the Bactoid Droid and Gore. So if you're looking for more ways to like pay off with exploit, those are really the options. There's not a lot of exploit in Mono Green, unfortunately. I would have liked to have another one, but I didn't find these 2 to be crazy good. Although Gore is definitely worth a shot because of if you can exploit him for 3, he can come out at 6 resources, which does curve really well into Maul, right? You can Gore on 6 and Maul on 7, and that can close out a lot of games. It's just wiping your whole board with something like Gore is a little counterintuitive to the plan because our plan involves a lot of going wide. But I think there is an angle where Gore can be pretty powerful. And then the Bactoid Droid is just like a minier version of that. That also doesn't overwhelm, but and last, Endless Legions. I mean, why not? You can like if you really want to like try to go really long with a control deck, you can play this. You're gonna need to include a few things in this deck that aren't there that make sure you wouldn't lose to a control deck. So obviously Relentless to shut off something like Super Laser Blast, but usually one card like that is not enough because if they have like fodder plus Super Laser Blast, you're going to wipe your whole board. So you need to like tune your deck a little bit to like make sure you're using Endless Legions correctly and winning off of it so you don't get blasted out of the game. All right, so that's it. This deck is super fun. It's very different than like basically any deck I've played. It's very unique. I think it's pretty powerful. Not going to go out and tell you it's going to win the world tour or anything, but I think it can certainly win things, and I've identified some weaknesses, of course, especially into like controlling decks. Sometimes mid-range decks are going to be able to stall you out and keep you from like accomplishing your like plan as well. So you just need to like have plans for those kinds of strategies and just practice this because it does play differently than a lot of other decks. Of course, if you're looking for updates to this deck, check out my Patreon. That's where I update all decks live. Please subscribe if you haven't already to the channel. And until next time, take care.